Hello, everyone. It's Charlene Lee. Thank you for joining us. And today I have a special guest. I have Scott Anthony from Innosight, where he's a senior partner. So, Scott, thank you so much for joining us. And where are you joining us from?
I'm joining us, like most of the world, from my home. And my home is indeed in Singapore. So good morning, everyone from Singapore. Happy Friday. I know it's Thursday for many of you, but it already has hit Friday here at 8 a.m.
Well, that's fantastic. I always keep the international date line totally screws me up. So I never know which side of it I'm on. So thank you so much for joining us. And what I wanted to talk today about is you really focus on disruption and what to do about it. So you have a really interesting perspective about what leaders are going through and a very global perspective too as well. What are you seeing leaders doing right now? What are some of the biggest mistakes that leaders are doing in the light of all the crises that they're facing?
Yeah, it's a great question, Charlene, and thanks again for having me as part of this discussion. You know, back in March, before the world went a little bit crazy, I and a friend of mine, Michael Putz, we had an article in the Sloan Management Review, and the article was titled "How Leaders Delude Themselves About Disruption." Our organization was co-founded by Clayton Christensen, late great Harvard Business School professor, who brought the idea of disruptive change to the business world. He wrote a seminal book 23 years ago, The Innovators Dilemma: New Technologies Cause Great Firms to Fail. The technical answer to disruption is out there. It's not that hard. People know what they need to do, yet the dilemma persists. And in that article, we said the problem is organizations are run by humans, and humans have biases and blind spots that lead to them basically underestimating the threat of disruption and overestimating how hard it is to respond. Now, we wrote the article pre-COVID, post-COVID. The number one lie that we see leaders tell themselves is that now isn't the time for us to think about the future. They say, I'm so busy focusing on operational related things, making sure my supply chain works. I don't have space to think about tomorrow. But you have to think about tomorrow because every current decision has future implications. So your choice is either you unconsciously prioritize the past because you optimize what exists versus thinking about what might exist, or you consciously consider the future and you make sure the present decisions connect into where you want to go in a future reality. And that's the mistake we see people making. It's very understandable in the midst of a crisis, but it's a big challenge because what ends up happening is you wake up in 2022 with another crisis of your own making, where the gap between where you now are and where you want to be, you just can't close it.
I love that the choices, you think you're not making any choices, you're just staying the course. But I love this phrase, it has consequences for the future, the decisions you make today. So the way I put it is that if you aren't intentionally choosing to stay here, but you're doing it as a default, it means that you're not looking at all the different options. And especially because your customers have probably fundamentally changed in light of everything that's happening, you're not serving them well. Who do you think is actually doing a good job of making these choices? Do you have examples? You don't have to name names if you don't want to, but how have you seen some people, some leaders grappling with, I got to do things like make sure my employees are safe versus I've got to go find growth opportunities?
Yeah, you know, there are some that I can talk about publicly that tie to some recent research that we've done. So we published a research report just the other week that looked at transformation champions that we see in ASEAN countries, of which Singapore is one of them. And one of the ones we highlighted that's been in a number of our research reports and is a focal case study in a book I have coming out later this year called Eat, Sleep, Innovate is DBS Bank, the largest bank in the region. And DBS, it's a fascinating story. You know, when I moved to Singapore 2010, nobody told me I should bank with DBS. They said, oh, DBS, dodgy incumbent, poor customer service, et cetera, et cetera. Today, it's widely recognized as one of the most, if not the most innovative banks in the world. So it has undergone a fundamental transformation. And what has happened over the past few months has essentially been a redoubling of that transformation, where they were driving digital to the core. And they said, well, we are now suddenly digitally dislocated, so let's accelerate the things we're trying to do. And let's be purposeful and conscious about using all the things that allowed us to be more innovative externally, internally, so we can make work from home a more pleasant experience. We can think about how we build culture and community when we can't gather in the same sorts of ways, and continue at pace to drive the changes that they're doing with customers, with stakeholders, with suppliers, with small businesses, and so on. It really is a very impressive thing to see. It's deep commitment from leadership, from its CEO, Piyush Gupta down, and it is a mindset in many cases. You know, call it the equivalent of the growth mindset. Never Waste a Good Crisis, where you say, yes, there's a lot of bad things happening now. Let's not pretend that they're not, but let's also recognize that we have some opportunities to go and lock in some of the sudden gains that we have as we now have experienced what it's like, and recognize we can do some really great things when we're using these kinds of platforms to communicate in different ways. And just an example of this, there was a different Singapore organization I was doing something with, and this is 100% owned by one of the sovereign wealth funds here in Singapore. And we were having a dialogue with its top team, its board of directors, its investors, younger members of its team, some outside government stakeholders. And this was done all over Zoom. And I will tell you, if this were face-to-face, all the VIPs would be at one table in the front of the room. They would be the only ones who talk. The rest of the room would sit and watch. But over Zoom, if you manage it in the right way, everybody is participating. And you're getting the younger, next generation people challenging very senior board members in a really good discussion. And I promise that could not have happened with the dynamics in a room. So, again, there's some things that are not bad from the current circumstance.
I want to go back to DBS for a second, because it sounds like all the forces were aligned. Great CEO, crisis creating this situation and an opportunity. It sounds like it was easy. I mean, were they just perfectly positioned? Did they have the right culture? Was it hard? Just give me a little bit more detail, because it sounds too perfect. It feels like they pushed the easy button, but I'm sure that wasn't the case.
Well, it's always the case with these things that they look, it's like the duck swimming on the water, right? It looks easy, but underneath the water, the duck's legs are moving very furiously. And the reason why it looked relatively straightforward is the 10 years of consistent, backbreaking work that is done to change the culture. And the thing that we've learned, and full disclosure, we've done consulting work with DBS. The thing that we've learned with an organization like DBS that really was trying to do a tech-driven transformation, where they said we have to go digital to the core. We used to outsource, now we have to control technology. We used to have a back office, now we've got to integrate things together more. We have to be customer-centric, et cetera. We have learned that technology only changes if people change, if the things that people do change on a routine, repeatable, day-to-day basis. So the thing that DBS has done an extremely good job of is thinking about all those micro moments where a leader says this versus that, where a team does this versus that, where an engineer chooses to do this versus that, have them consistently be things that are the sorts of things you'd see in more of a tech startup-based environment than what you traditionally see in a stodgy regulated bank. That didn't happen overnight. I mean, there's been a whole team dedicated to this. They've set up their innovation in a very interesting and different way. So they have an innovation team, but their innovation team has only one rule. And that team's rule is, under no circumstances should they actually innovate. So the innovation team is not there to innovate. It's to help the 28,000 other people in the organization innovate. Sometimes in day-to-day ways, make the lines at the ATM shorter. Sometimes in more path-breaking ways, can we create APIs so that banking can disappear into interfaces in many other companies throughout the world. But again, it looks easier today because there was that 10 years of really diligent work to drive a true cultural transformation. And last thing I'll say, one of the things this has taught me, if you can take a Singaporean bank, this is a process-obsessed country that is a highly regulated industry. If that kind of organization can really become someone that innovation is something that is a natural act, anybody can do it. You can't tell me I can't do it, because if DBS can do it, you can do it. Any organization can do
it. Excuse me. One question that I'm seeing from people, and there's quite a few people coming in from all around SEN. I see my friend Blums, my colleague, who says, never waste a good crisis, right? And it really just really believes that DBS is a great story and example. When you're talking about these transformations, what you emphasized is that it's not about just the digital. The technology is important, but the people part, the transformation part. We oftentimes think of innovation only from a technology perspective, only from a digital. And we think once we do that, done. But you and I know it's so much about human people and the aspects of how they work together that really makes a difference.
Yeah, I agree. There's two parts to that. So if you look at what you can do with digital, we think of digital in a couple different ways. So if you see over my shoulder the green or teal or whatever color book there is called dual transformation, and that's the short answer for what organizations need to do in the face of a market disruption. They have to transform, fundamental change in form or substance, and it's not one, it's two. It's a dual transformation. Transformation A is repositioning today's business to make it more resilient. Transformation B is creating tomorrow's business. So if you think about digital, the A component is how do we digitize our current operations? How do we digitize our interfaces with customers and suppliers and so on? But that's today. Then the B business is the new business model. So for DBS, it's how do we create digital APIs that allow banking to spread and disappear? It's a very different business model. So that's one component to it, where you recognize that digital is not just digitizing today, it's enabling tomorrow. And then the second thing is ultimately these things only happen with human beings making choices. One of the most critical moments in the DBS story is, the DBS story is not, we're going to go and hire a bunch of young millennial and put them on the side, they're going to be. And it's not, we're going to buy a startup and that's going to be where we get it's really, we've got people that are humans, and humans are curious and they're ingenious and they're adaptable. As a species, we're going to unleash that potential. So the big moment they had is early in their journey, they went to go visit companies in Silicon Valley, as you do, and they were visiting Netflix, and they were kind of grumbling to Netflix. They said, oh yeah, it's easy for you because, you're right here in the West Coast, you get all these young engineers, and we can't do that. And the person they were talking to said, okay, let's talk about that for a minute. Our average engineer is about 40 years old. How old is yours? DBS said, about the same age. And the guy from Netflix said, you know what? Actually, most of our engineers, or many of our engineers, we hire from companies like yours. We just get out of their way. And that was kind of the penny drop moment where DBS said, this is not that we don't have the right people. It's our systems and structure and culture and ways in which we're working. That's what we really have to go and attack. And it was a really transformational moment for them.
That's amazing. I so believe that the way you set up structure, processes, even the lore, the rituals, the symbols, and the stories make a huge difference in allowing all of that disruptive thinking to come through. I want to go and ask you, what are you seeing from Singapore? Because I want to take advantage of the fact that you all have been living with COVID and disruption and recessions and changes for longer than pretty much anybody else. How do you see it evolving? What are some people doing right to deal with this? And what could we learn in the US and Europe from the experiences in Asia?
It's an interesting day to ask this question. It's June 19th, and this is the beginning of what Singapore is called phase 2 today. So Singapore, the short story is the first part of the crisis in kind of January, February, handled magnificently. So early cases were identified, thoroughly dealt with. There was little community spread, et cetera. Then around the middle of March, kind of the world comes home. So students come home and executives come home. And Singapore made one mistake, which is they required people to go and self-isolate or go in quarantine for 14 days, but they could do it at home. And the people that they live with could go out into the community. And predictably, the virus spread. And we went into what was known as a circuit breaker in early April. That lasted until early June. Early June, they went to phase 1, which is a few more stores open, the schools open. Now phase 2, retail open, swimming pools at condos open. It's, not normal, but it's closer to normal. So the couple things that I would note is Singapore, as always, deserves credit for thoroughness and thoughtfulness. They have thought through every little detail about what happens here, what happens there, what criteria must be in place for this business to open or that business to open. There are a lot of rules. It's a long list, but it's totally transparent. And you can go and understand it and know what you need to do. And there's no ambiguity about whether you can or cannot wear a mask. If I go out of my place without a mask, there's a possibility of a $10,000 fine. And because it's Singapore and there are 8 gazillion cameras around, believe you me, you will pay a $10,000 fine. And during the circuit breaker period, it was very clear that you could not have visitors, so you could not socialize with other people outside of home. And what Singapore does is it names and shames. So there were a bunch of students that got together to study together, and every student was named in the newspaper, $5,000 fine for violating the protocols for. So you can debate this, but Singapore is, as always, thoughtful and thorough. That's point 1. Then point 2, what I'm seeing increasingly from companies is essentially a mindset shift. Now, this was legitimately a crisis in March. We didn't know what was going to happen. countries were all of a sudden locking down. Is the global supply chain going to hold? Are we going to have, tens of millions of casualties? We didn't know. We're not in a crisis anymore. I don't think it's fair to call it a crisis anymore. This is a condition. We know what we're dealing with. It's not pretty in places. It can be pretty ugly in places, but it's not unknown. This is a virus that spreads. It spreads in predictable ways. It has predictable consequences. The way that you stop it, we know. The way you slow it, we know. It's just a question of what we choose to do. So for companies, they recognize that it's a different world, but the world's not ending, and they got to think about what's coming next. And that's what I'm seeing companies increasingly doing out here, thinking about what's next, what do they do differently, how do they really position themselves for the long term, and how do they take advantage of what will inevitably be the opportunities that are created by this current moment, because they know, we all know, they always exist.
Can you give an example of some of the ways to think about those opportunities? Because I get asked all the time from people. Look, I know the opportunities are there. This is not something I'm used to doing. I'm used to operating my business, kind of incrementally increasing it each year. So how do I actually think about finding these opportunities in the midst of this crisis?
Yeah, Charlene, one of the things that we did, we first did it 11 years ago. I wrote a book called The Silver Lining in the middle of the global financial crisis that talked about silver lining. Hey, there are always opportunities for innovation and growth, is to go and look and say, what does the past teach us? And the past teaches us that there is an opportunity always in the midst of a situation like this to essentially reverb off of or echo off of what it is that is causing the disruption. So if you go back to the 1970s oil crisis, this is the moment Toyota becomes Toyota, small cars. People want more fuel efficient cars. You look at the global financial crisis, you have a lot of unicorns that are created in the asset sharing space and new financial providers like Stripe and Square, because people don't trust traditional institutions. So kind of the mindset here is, if you look at what's going on now, where we've had accelerated digital migration, where you have healthcare fundamentally transforming, where you've got socioeconomic dislocation, what are the second order things that open up because of the fissures we now begin to see? I mean, there's obvious things like telemedicine's got to be better and online education's got to be better. But what do you do to think about redesigning the way that work is set up, or redesigning sometimes the way that cities are set up, or thinking about how do you do mental well-being when we can't be together physically as much, and blah, 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 blah. So I think number one, the answer is look for the opportunity, have the growth mindset, realize that they are there. Number two, just follow the disruption and look not for what's happening today. The first order things, the world will take care of the first order things. It's the second order things. It's what changes after that you begin to say, okay, this is my opportunity. And then the last thing I would say for an established company, one of the big things you want to watch for is what temporary behaviors you see now, which of those are going to stick. The thing that we come back to repeatedly is the job to be done. So those of you who know Innosight, know Clay Christensen, know that we believe people don't buy products, they hire them to get jobs done in their lives. So look at the solutions that people are choosing between, look at the circumstances they're in, look at how the criteria they're using are changing, and that can help you understand what will stick and what won't.
That's fantastic. That's a great way to be thinking about those templates. I want to start just recognizing some people, and also want to make sure that people know how to get in touch with you. So I'm putting your email here. Scott has generously said, yeah, just email him with any questions. And also, if you have any questions in just the next few minutes, I'm happy to take them too as well. Scott, you can see some of the comments here too as well. I think the idea of the innovation, right? And in particular, how you have to think about this very differently in the crisis, look for those opportunities. I think there are so many examples of companies that have been looking for these disruptions and the ways that things have changed. And we know that needs have changed. People have shifted the way they do things. And so when things shift, the needs don't go away. They actually are changing and shifting. One of the pieces of advice I give to people is to start questioning everything. I like the fact that you talk about the first order, it's the second order. You have to dig down deeper and deeper and deeper so that you can understand what are the fundamental needs that have changed. And you can't assume that your customers' needs haven't changed unless you go and look. Sort of where we started out with at the very beginning.
No, and I think part of that too, Charlotte, I absolutely agree. I think the thing you want to look for is what are people doing that you just wouldn't have expected them to do? Or what are the things that you see them experimenting with that they say, hey, this actually, like, take this as an example. I mean, we didn't think that we could do things like this a few months ago. We didn't think the session I had with the Singaporean company where we had 60 people, multi-generation, in a fierce discussion. We didn't think we could do that. But then we experimented and we learned that technological solutions actually work incredibly well to do certain things, and we won't snap back. There are other things where we've run the experiment and we said, you know what, this actually sucks. I've got 4 kids here. They were doing virtual learning, and hey, credit to their schools for doing everything they could to make it suck less than it possibly could, but it still sucked. So when they reopened the schools in Singapore, first people in line to go there, because you just can't replicate. Kids are 14, 12, 8, and 3. You can't replicate the in-class experience. You can't replicate the ability to watch what Harry's doing and be able to online yet. So those are things where you see people experimenting and getting really frustrated. So that they're going to snap back when they can, versus having virtual meetings where you say, actually, this has worked better, and I don't have the fatigue of having to travel to San Francisco from Singapore to be able to do this. This is and I'm wearing shorts rather than long pants. This is a much better experience. I haven't worn long pants in 3 months.
Yeah, we were
for the audience. I think that's most of the world, right?
Yeah, somebody was saying that they actually put on a collared shirt and what's a tie, right? Mm-hmm. So the idea that we're not going to go back. The forecast coming out of the Fortune 500 CEOs is that we're not going to go back to travel the way we did before. Like, why would we? We don't need to. We've proven that this can work. So it's fascinating to see. It'll be interesting to see, again, how people actually start thinking about this, construct their businesses very differently, even think about how office space will work in the future. So I want to close it down. Any last thoughts, things that you want to leave the audience with about, best practices, ways to be thinking about disruption?
Yeah, I'll end with the story. So there's a family friend named Helen Eden, best friend of my sister, who 10 years ago became the CEO of a not-for-profit called the Settlement Music School. It's in the Philadelphia area. They've got 6 physical branches where they've taught classes historically to children, jazz music, classical music, etc. Over the last 10 years, Helen has transformed the business. She's taken the physical centers and expanded them. So there's also classes for adults. There's new offerings that merge together arts and therapy, very innovative offerings. And she's found ways to get out of the centers to really infuse music in the local community. So I got an email from Helen a couple months ago, and you might have assumed it was despondent. 6 physical centers, the world is locking down, not-for-profit, not a huge budget. What do you do? But Helen was full of joy and full of optimism. She said, yeah, this is not a great situation. I get this. But I've always wanted to open up a 7th branch, a virtual one. And now I have no choice. So I have to go and do it. And she then sees the opportunity. Now 170 teachers are giving music lessons, not just to people in the Philadelphia area, because once you start getting rid of distance, you can do it anywhere. And she's thinking about all the new opportunities that digital enables. So this mindset that, yes, today is bad and tomorrow will sometime be good, and there are opportunities that I can realize, I think is a critical mindset. And for her, it's kept coming back to purpose. Their purpose is to educate people, to spread music. And as she wrote in an email to her board of directors, why do we keep doing this in the midst of a pandemic? Because music lifts the spirit and it lifts the soul. And this is the part that we can play in it. So I think that's a mindset that leaders really need to have today. It is hard, no doubt about it. But there also are plenty of moments for joy and for optimism for the leaders that can go and make that beautiful music.
I love how you emphasize with her that they lean into their purpose. And now more than ever, to lean into the real true purpose. It's not to give music lessons in person. That wasn't their purpose. It was to really lift up the spirit and bring music into people's lives. You don't have to necessarily be standing there with the student. And that's a great realization that they can live their purpose in so many different ways.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for that story. And thank you for your wisdom and for your expertise and sharing that with all of us. I want to thank you again, Scott, for joining us from Singapore. Thank you for getting up early. And thank you so many people for coming and joining this. We've got a lot. It's a very international group here today, Scott. I don't know if you've been seeing this. You've got people from Texas.
We need you to Texas. That's it. You've got the whole globe covered.
We've got so many, and they're all looking forward to your book, as am I. So it's a great title: Eat, Sleep,
Innovate. Yeah, the idea, and I take no credit for it, as the publisher. We had a really boring title. The title that we had was something like Unleashing Innovation. And the publisher said that's so generic. And he came back, it's Harvard Business Review Press. And he came back with Eat, Sleep, Innovate. And the idea is you eat every day, you sleep every day. Why don't you innovate every day? And that's what the book is about. How do you make the things that allow you to innovate, how do you make them day-to-day habits for yourself, for your team, for your group, for your organization?
Fantastic. Fantastic. Thank you again, Scott, so much. Be well, be healthy, stay sane in the midst of all this chaos. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Thank you so much for watching this broadcast. Have a great day.
Thanks, all. Thanks, Charlene.
Thank you.